Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon, and we have another one of our special biblical episodes, which may one day be a sort of paid thing that you go through a paywall to get, but for now I'm just giving them away for free, just very generously. And it's our second Exploring Genesis edition, and of course we have the Rev Jamie Franklin. Welcome back to the show, Jamie.
Thanks, Nick. Is that what it's called, Exploring Genesis?
The first one I called Exploring Genesis Part 1, so
Okay.
I'm thinking about just going crazy and calling this Exploring Genesis Part 2.
Yeah.
Or I might call it Cain and Abel, because what we're thinking of doing today is doing Cain and Abel and then Noah, or we might just do Cain and Abel because there might be so much.
And talking about the Nephilim as well. That's the other thing we've got to do, isn't it?
And talking about the Nephilim,
I don't
which
want
were
to miss the Nephilim.
some angels came down and bred with humans and it all kicked off in a nutshell. So yeah, we might get onto that. And hopefully this will be entertaining for people who are not Christian, but also people did really like the last one. People said it was enlightening. Some people said they've been back to church because of it. Wow. So that was great. So we're back doing another one. And,
That's good, man. That's good.
Let's crack on with it. I thought we'd start with Cain and Abel. So obviously, I mean, where to start? I'll just start with the start. I'll just read it. So it says, "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." So obviously knew meaning had sex with. I mean, as David Pawson pointed out, that the tree of knowledge really is the tree of experience, because knew is that, you know, is that definition. That's what we said last time. Anyway.
There's a great translation of this which I came across in the New International Version, where it translates it as now. I think it says, "Now Adam made love to Eve his wife," and I thought that was quite hilarious, actually. Quite a hilarious
Barry White version.
rendering of the Hebrew, yeah. Adam made
I think I'll
love.
stick with new. Do you know
Made
what I mean?
love.
We're in Sunday school and we're sort of like, we can't be saying that.
There's a bit graphic.
So now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. I've got to read this so that I'm still in the mic. Let me try and read it here.
Yeah. Go for it, man.
Conceived and bore Cain, saying, "I have produced a man with the help of the Lord." And there the Lord is capitalized, meaning, so it means it's Yahweh in the original. I've got some stuff on that later. "And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground." And it's been pointed out by people like Jordan Peterson that shepherds then were pretty tough people. They weren't sort of the people we think of them from children's books now. It was a tough life. So a shepherd was someone pretty tough. But what do you think about Cain being a worker of the ground? Because that comes up later, where it's like a motif. His brother's voice screams from the ground because he's put him in the ground, and he's a worker of the ground. And now he's cursed that the ground won't yield to him anymore. So is there anything there, or is it just a motif?
No, I think, I mean, that's interesting. I've not really thought about it before. In terms of the thing about the ground. Yeah, no, I think that's very good. I mean, Peterson talks about, doesn't he, how this is a kind of, an archetype of the eternal battle between herdsmen and people. What would they be called? Like people who grow things.
No,
right?
yeah, the nomadic versus the stable farms.
Yeah.
I've also heard that as well.
Yeah. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, that seems to make sense, doesn't it? And then I guess, I mean, I don't know whether you want me to get onto this straight away, but that comes up again, doesn't it, when you have the two sacrifices, and Cain's sacrifice is an offering of the fruit of the ground. Whereas, oh, sorry, did you?
We'll get onto that. We'll get onto that because that's so massive. I was just getting slightly ahead of myself and asking you about the ground bit, and I was looking for a smaller bookmark, but I didn't have one. There's a lot of logistics to this podcast, so let's press on and go. Yeah, Cain, a work of the ground. "In the course of time, Cain brought the Lord," again capitalized, "an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard." So this is a key part, or one of the key parts. Yeah. Now, why did he have no regard is one big question. Like, was it just, that's life sometimes, you do things right and it doesn't go well and no one cares? Or was it that there was something weaker or worse about Cain's offering?
Yeah. So, I mean, Peterson's very ambivalent about this, isn't he? He sort of says, well, it may have been that there was something worse or something better, but maybe he was just not favored by God. I mean, I think that, in terms of the actual, the real answer, I mean, Peterson does these kind of interesting, well, maybe this and maybe that, but the real answer, I think, is in the text, because it talks about Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. So it's just a bare offering, right? And then in verse 4, Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portion. So I think that that's the key. I mean, some people think that it's to do with, blood versus, crops or whatever, soil. Like blood is better than crops. But that's that wouldn't really be very fair on Cain, because Cain was a worker of the ground. So it's actually, I think, to do with that contrast between an offering and the firstborn. So Cain just gives an offering, whereas Abel gives of the firstborn of his flock, and that would have spoken to the original audience, because if you believe, as I do, that Moses wrote these books, then he was writing to a people that would have understood in the sacrificial system at the time. You offered the best of what you have to the Lord, and you don't just offer you don't just offer whatever as Cain did. So I think that seems to be what's going on here. And so there's a critique of a kind of half-baked kind of arrogant approach to the worship of God, a kind of self-created religion on his own terms. He's approaching the Lord on his own terms, in probably quite an arrogant, entitled way, whereas Abel's offering is an offering, of humility from the heart, and therefore he's offering his best. So it seems to me that's the case there.
I was wondering if God just hated vegetarians. He's like, you bring the meat, you just bring some blooming fruits and vegetables. What's that all about? But so I've had a few ideas of my own. But then if you look at Paulson's, I'm going to get onto my ideas in the next line. But if you look at Paulson's idea on that, it's actually because God accepted Abel's sacrifice because Abel had learned from his parents that the only sacrifice worthy of God is a blood sacrifice, the result of a life taken in death. And he's referring to the earlier part in Genesis where God covered the sin and shame of his parents, of Adam and Eve, by killing animals. So Adam and Eve wore those hides as clothing, hence the animal sacrifice. So he's saying, God respects animal sacrifice.
I don't really see.
That's Paulson's idea.
That's true. God clearly, he demands animal sacrifices in various contexts in the Mosaic law. But Cain is a worker of the ground, so he doesn't have any animal sacrifice to offer. And I think the contrast, you can just see it right here in the text: an offering of the fruit of the ground on the part of Cain, and the firstborn of his flock on the part of Abel. Now, if Cain had offered the first fruits of the fruit of the ground, then the author would have written that down and said it. But that's the contrast, right. That the one was not the first fruits and the other was the firstborn, I think. So that to me makes sense. Yeah.
He half-assed it. It was just
it makes miles more sense to me, because how could Cain offer a blood sacrifice when he didn't have any blood sacrifices to give? That's in the sacrificial system as well, in the Mosaic law.
Great point.
There's provision given for people who can't afford to give, lambs or animals. They can give lesser animals, or they can give offerings of crops and things like that. So, in the sacrificial system, the Lord takes into account the economic situation of people who offer things. So I think Paulson's one sounds very nice, and in a way it sort of is theologically very apt, but I don't know whether it's really supported here. I don't really think that that's necessarily the point of what's going on.
You're saying, if I were a shepherd, I would give a lamb. Yeah, you're right. Paulson, he does say things with extraordinary confidence. And that was because of this, and I've just said that. Now you'll have to check if that's actually the case.
Of the things I've listened to him
but it's very convincing.
So far is when he says there's something. What does he say? There's something particularly inhuman about an old person and a cat. And what he means is it's not great when you're an old person with no friends and you've only got a cat, but it just sounded really just funny, he just says that by itself. Something it's kind of.
Yeah, he's from the north, old school, and one of my favourites is when he just says, he talks about Yahweh, and he said that people thought that was Jehovah, and he goes, but that's a mistake because it's actually pronounced Yahweh. So this is the entire Jehovah's Witness movement there, just in one line. That's a mistake, and they're absolute idiots. So he was an old school northern guy. But by the way, in case anyone doesn't know what we're referring to, in case I forgot to mention, that's the David Pawson Unlocking the Bible series, which we very much focused on last time. And so that's just a quick reminder of that. Oh, one sec, sorry.
Just to come back on this thing about, you said this thing about the worker of the ground. That's quite an interesting idea, actually, which I'd not thought about. But that motif, you are right. Obviously the ground is cursed. And I don't know whether you mentioned this earlier, but in verse 7, when it talks about sin crouching at the door, that's interesting, isn't it? The sin is down, crouching, and coming up, and kind of presumably pulling. It's there ready to sort of pull you down. And that's I've been reading the. I don't know whether you've ever come across Matthew Pajot's book on Genesis. Have you ever come across it? It's called The Language of Creation. He's Jonathan Pajot's brother. But he talks about this the spatial metaphor of like heaven and earth. Heaven being the realm of spirit, God, enlightenment, wisdom, and so on, and earth being material, density, corporeality, and I suppose as well potentially sin. So it's interesting that you've got that image of like, Cain is a worker of the ground, and also sin is crouching at the door. He's down there. Sin is down there, ready, like a person, ready to come and sort of grab you and pull you down. So yeah, it's kind of interesting there. That's an interesting idea.
Yes, well, Jamie, I got an A at English A level, so you've got to watch out for me in these little motifs. I will find them. Cain, a work of the ground, yeah. And then it says, the voice of your brother's blood, which I'll get onto, is crying to me from the ground. And then later, when you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. So there's definitely something going on.
Good observation. Yeah.
And I also have an MA in
I won't mention my degrees. Don't need to.
No, don't mention them. Let's keep them out of it completely. You've got too many. The podcast will be too long. Only as a postgraduate, I hasten to add. Proper degrees. Let's put that in. So, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, or wrath in the King James Version, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door." Let's just stop there for a sec. So, I love this line, "If you do well, will you not be accepted?" And I've been thinking about this line a lot. I've been thinking about it in the light of another theological work, The Devil Wears Prada.
I've never seen it, no.
Because have you watched the film The Devil Wears Prada? It's a classic. Well, the character played by Anne Hathaway, Andrea, as Meryl Streep calls it, is she's sort of complaining. The job's not going that well. She's being told off a lot, but she thinks she's trying really hard. And she says to Stanley Tucci's character, Nigel, she goes, "But I'm trying." And Nigel goes, "Be serious, Andy. You are not trying. You are whining." And it's this great moment. You couldn't have in movies anymore. An older man telling a younger girl she's whining and just needs to get on with it. And he is gay, which mitigates somewhat against that, but probably not enough. So anyway, he's saying, "You're whining." And she goes, "Okay." And then she realizes what she's got to do. She's got to make a bigger effort. She's got to wear the clothes that the boss likes. Really embrace the job rather than just sort of deign to work there, as he puts it. And she thinks she's above it. She thinks she's better than it. But actually, there's very few things you're better than if done properly, really. So my thing here is, if you do well, will you not be accepted? It's like, you know you've done well because it would have been accepted. You know what I mean? It's like, you'll know when you've done enough because you'll get there. Anything else is just complaining and BS, basically. That's what I took from that.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, because I've been listening, I've been listening to that Peterson lecture over the past day, having you sent it over for me to listen to, so that's really on my mind. But it is hard to not see this as a kind of, I mean, clearly there's kind of theological things that we could talk about here, but there's a very clear moral lesson here, isn't there? Whether it's in terms of the worship of God or just in our everyday lives. I suppose the point is that the Lord is offering Cain a way back, right? So he can take heed of what the Lord is saying to him and accept that he's made a mistake in the way that he is approaching things, or he can persist in this behavior and see what happens. But, obviously the problem is that, sin is crouching at his door, his desire is contrary to you, and you must rule over it. So there's agency here for Cain. It's not like he has to do this, It's not like he has to persist in this way. And it does speak to us very deeply, doesn't it? That we have opportunities in life where we can, in a religious sense, we can repent of our sin, but also in general we can acknowledge our mistakes and say sorry and try and fix them to the best of our abilities, or we can persist in arrogance and continue, the path that we're on, and things will just get worse and worse and worse, and they'll spiral, and obviously we can see what happens. Oh, can I read a quote from this? And I'm using an embargoed commentary. I can't say what it is, right? So I'm not going to say, but I've got a really good commentary which hasn't been published yet. But it's a quote from a writer called Francis Schaeffer, and he's a a man who's dead now, but he was an evangelical kind of intellectual, I suppose. But this is an important point about this whole thing, because in Cain and Abel we can kind of see these sort of two strands of humanity. Now, I don't think this is meant at all like in a racial sense or anything like that, or a predetermined sense. Like anyone can be either of these lines. So you've got Abel, who's the righteous, Cain, who is the unrighteous, and then later on Abel is replaced by Seth, as it were. But the point is about the way we approach God, and the way we worship God, the way we imagine God to be. Anyway, this quotation from Francis Schaeffer is a good one. It said, "From this time on, in the flow of history, there are two humanities. The one humanity says there is no God, or it makes gods in its own imagination, or it tries to come to the true God in its own way. The other humanity comes to the true God in God's way. There is no neutral ground." And I think as well, the other thing that occurs to me to say with this thing about Cain and Abel is these are individuals, but they apply to individuals, but it also applies, societally as well, I would say. And I think, our society is clearly going the way of Cain by ignoring the things of God and making decisions or taking directions which don't take any heed of God and God's ways. And we always have a way out. We always have an opportunity to turn back and to rediscover wisdom, or we can just carry on and find out what's going to happen. And in this case, it's bad, obviously, in the Cain and Abel story, and it will be bad for us as individuals and as a society if we persist in sin and godlessness. And of course, we're going to see the sort of degradation of the world as not only Cain but humanity in general kind of moves in this direction. So,
okay, I've got some other thoughts on the two lines.
Yeah.
But at first, maybe I wanted to check and see what you thought to this. When we talk about if you do well, will you not be accepted? I saw this completely different translation that sort of threw that off completely, which was on Wikipedia. I'm not sure exactly where they got it from. It said, "Why are you incensed, and why is your face fallen? For whether you offer well or whether you do not, at the tent flap sin crouches, and for you it is longing, but you will rule over it." So in this version, whether you do well or not, the same thing will happen. So sin will be there either way. So that's a completely different reading where he has sort of no agency. It's going to be the same whatever his offering is. Really? That throws it off completely.
You don't
but I couldn't figure out where they got that from.
Yeah.
It was someone else's translation, I think.
It doesn't say which translation it is.
I tried to look at the footnote, and then it said something, but I didn't really get it. So that would change it completely, but then most people don't go with that. So what is your take on sin is crouching at the door?
Sin is crouching at the door. I mean, I just think that means, it's an interesting image, isn't it? So is it crouching, I don't know, on the other side of the door that you walk through? It's right there, and it will spring upon you and you have to master it. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Is that there's a confrontation with sinful desire coming one way or another. So, the sin is there. It's going, you have to reckon with it, and you can either allow it to overcome you or you can overcome it. And that's, there I'm looking at the English Standard Version, you must rule over it. It's interesting. I've also got the NIV, which in a sense is a less literal translation, but it says you must master it. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it. But essentially it's like this kind of personification of sin. Like sin is a kind of being, almost like a spiritual being maybe. And that comes up, that sort of idea that sin is not just a sort of concept, but a sort of spiritual power with its own sort of ontological status is something that comes up over and over again. I actually wrote an essay once on Romans chapter 5 where the Apostle Paul speaks about sin and death entering the world. Romans 5 he talks that way, like they're actual kind of powers that rule over the world. So it's a sort of personification of sin. You could take that literally or not, as the case may be, but that's kind of the way I see it. Yeah,
and in the King James Version, just so we have loads of versions, it's sin lieth at the door. So it's very similar. Nick Cave sang, "There's a devil waiting outside your door," which obviously he nicked from this. What does it say after that? It says, "And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him." So unto thee shall be his desire is actually quite clear. That's sin trying to act upon you, I would say. And what's interesting, I was going to ask you as well, sin is crouching at your door. The next line in the English Standard Version is, its desire is contrary to you. But the word contrary is the same word where they say or towards, which is the same word when Eve's desire, may your desire be contrary to your husband when he curses Eve. God curses Eve, as we discussed last time. But weird, it can also mean towards, and towards seems more likely in this context.
Yeah, like adversarially, I think it kind of means it like that, like a clash. That's the way it seems to me. By the way, have you ever heard Metallica's version of Love a Man by Nick Cave?
No.
Oh, you should look it up. Nick. I know how much you like metal.
I love metal, but I'm glad you got that the song was Lover Man. So obviously you're a Nick Cave fan as well.
Yeah,
well, you wouldn't have got that just from that one lyrical reference.
I've got it, man. I know what you're talking about.
So hopefully the listener has some idea what we're talking about. We're talking about the Bible, and now we're talking about metal and the rock singer.
It's all linked. It's all linked. No, but I mean, no. This is a serious academic subject. It's biblical studies. It's called biblical reception. Where you go through and you look at the way the Bible has been received into culture through the arts, for example. And that's a good example. There's a devil waiting outside your door. Yeah, definitely.
All right. So I think that's all want to say on that for now, and then let me press on then. So, its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And we can think about Tom Waits as there as well. Cain slew Abel, killed him with a stone. So, if you want to do another musical reference, so
yeah,
Cain's that's in on his Bone Machine album. Anyway, Cain spoke to Abel and his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Which is amazing because that phrase is still used today.
Yeah.
And the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Which I love that. I mean, that's so good. That's such a great line. Mm-hmm. It's such a strange line. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And it's incredibly similar in the King James. "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." So he kills him, and the voice of his blood is crying out from the ground, and he denies it, of course, which is even worse. And that's when it says, "When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. So there's so much there, but I mean, the murder itself, the denial of it, and then the curse, the ground won't yield to you anymore. And then, so you're sort of going out of the kind of agricultural world, you're sort of forced into the urban world, which we might get onto in a minute.
Yeah.
And then that's that. And then the other part of the curse, which is quite strange to me, the fact that he doesn't allow people to kill him. It's like, I'm not going to allow people to kill Cain. It's like perhaps it's only God that can make these judgments, so no one else gets to kill him. And then there'll be revenge upon them sevenfold if they even try, if they do kill him. What's all that about?
Well, as you say, there's a lot here, isn't there? I mean, I think that one of the things that we need to recognise is the link between the section we've just read and then, the section before the section we've just read and then the section we've just read. So you've got a situation where Cain is offering, inappropriate worship to God. And I think the implication is quite clear that there's a link between, an inappropriate view of God, an inappropriate approach to God, and then this sort of the darkening of one's heart and mind that follows. So I think that's an important point there. These things aren't unrelated. It's because Cain has gone down this path of arrogance and pride and denial of his sin and wrongdoing that he then further compounds that by killing Abel. So why does he kill Abel? Because he's sort of stuck in this, this world where, God is fundamentally unjust and he hasn't been treated fairly. And so he's just going to kind of lash out and kill, which doesn't really make any sense on any level. But it's a kind of, it's just what he feels like doing. It will somehow bring some kind of validation or justification to him in some way. And then you've got this, as you say, these phrases which are so resonant. It's interesting, isn't it? In Peterson's lecture, he says that the Cain and Abel story is the most profound story he's ever read anywhere, which is amazing, really. And one of the things he says, which is, again, interesting, is he talks about the way these are really the first human beings. So this is kind of the epitome of humanity we're talking about here, because, Adam and Eve, they're not real. They are human beings, but they're not like us. They're created by God, and especially at a certain age. And so these people, Cain and Abel, they come from a woman, they're born of a woman. Anyway, so am I my brother's keeper? It's an amazing line, isn't it? And you think about it and you think, what did Cain even mean by that? Because of course he's his brother's keeper, you're brothers. And so Cain, he is born first, and then Abel's born second. So Cain's responsible for his brother. Of course he's his brother's keeper. So why is he saying this? You know, he's so sort of delusional that he's lost all sense of family loyalty, or I don't know, he just comes across like a person you can't have very much respect for.
It's a sort of petulant teenager line as well, isn't it? He's giving sass to God, really. What am I, his keeper? How do I know?
Yeah,
which is just...
but he is, you know. So he's failing on sort of every level. He's failing kind of theologically. He's failing morally, but then he's failing in that kind of sense of not being able to recognize what his duties and his responsibilities are. And again, the reason I think this is so profound is because we can see ourselves in this, and we can see humanity in this. And then again, you have this repetition of the sin of Adam when he's confronted with his failure and his sin, you know, his failure to take responsibility, his sin. He excuses himself, and then Cain does exactly the same thing. You know, he basically says, well, he lies. I don't know. So I'm not. It's not my responsibility anyway, and I don't know. But he does know. So he's just denying what he's done. So it's like this progression, you know, and it's so true, isn't it, that as we sin and as we try and cover it up, and then we sin more, try and cover it up, and we involve ourselves in a kind of deceptive web, and we can't possibly break free from it, and it gradually gets worse and worse, and spirals down and down and down into chaos and destruction. So I think there's something deeply, deeply profound about that, and again, you know, the point is that we can always come out of it as well. I mean, this story is really all about Cain, if you think about it. I mean, Abel just does the right thing, and then he's killed. He doesn't really have very much agency in the story. The story is all about Cain. We're supposed to see ourselves in this story. And then the thing about, well, you know, so Cain is punished by the Lord, but the Lord also preserves him as well. And I mean, we can get on to talking about what happens next after this, but I think the point is that God is showing his grace here, you know, because even Cain and his descendants, as it were, will be given the chance of being redeemed and being saved. God is very gracious, and so when Cain, a murderer, asks for mercy, he's given it by God. So you can see, I think the point there is that that God is simply merciful, and he's giving him even now after all of this, the possibility of redemption. So I think I kind of think that's the point there. He's protecting Cain, even though Cain is so sinful. And then I think the other thing as well, just to say here, is that, you know, God's judgment, and this is a topic obviously we'll come back to over and over again, because this is, you know, all these stories are about judgment. But you can see the purpose of God's judgment here, which is to wake Cain up, right? Because otherwise he's just going to persist in this message, in this type of behavior. He's hardened in his sin and his deceitfulness. And so the only thing that God can do is to judge him in order to wake him up and bring him back. So you could even say that it's a judgment, but this judgment is done in love, you know, to open his eyes to the reality. And again, you can kind of see that's all the way through Scripture, is that when God brings judgment, it's often to wake people up and to get them to reckon with their sin. I mean, an example that springs to mind is the sin of David. You know, when he sins with Bathsheba and then has her husband killed. You know, the Lord sends Nathan the prophet to tell David a story which moves his heart and convicts him. And he is punished severely for it, but part of the reason was to restore David, you know, to open his eyes and to wake him up. So there's also something there about God's judgment, I think, which is very true as well. Yeah. All
right. Loads of stuff there. I mean, yeah, Adam blames Eve, as you said, even though you could say, oh, Eve took the fruit and, you know, it wasn't Adam's fault, but as the head of the house, he should have checked, and, you know, so God says, why did you just go along with it? So he blames Eve, which goes very badly. Also reminds me a little bit of Peter denying Christ 3 times. These kind of things don't go well in the Bible. Denying responsibility does not go well in the Bible. This is what we learn here.
You can see why Jordan Peterson likes these stories so much, because they chime so well with his sort of message about, you know, tidy your room and so on.
Absolutely, the ultimate clean your bloody room, Cain. I mean, and with the sin crouching, I mean, yeah, Cain is really just, isn't he exhibiting? He's exhibited arrogance, laziness. Now it's also resentment and envy against his brother. And I do understand having a brother who was the favourite. There is an element of resentment about that if you're not careful.
Yeah.
So this is partly what's happening here, isn't it? It's a kind of classic tale of sibling resentment.
Is there something there which is sort of, it speaks to human nature, doesn't it? Which is that it's almost like the closer somebody is in proximity to you, the more they're a potential rival as well, I think. It's often the case with friends, isn't it? If you're friends with similar interests, maybe you have the same job or the same kind of career path or something like that, that's often much harder, isn't it, to bear if somebody's kind of beating you and they're similar to you. Yeah. And so I suppose the brothers thing is nobody is closer to you than your brother in that sense, that your brother basically is like another version of you, and they're just beating you because they're just better than you. That's terrible. That's a terrible situation to be in. So
yeah,
I think we can all relate to that.
In my own life, I was never competitive with my brother because we were so different. He got an A in physics and maths. I got an A in English and history. We sort of went very separate paths. Yeah. He does financial regulation, and I do whatever the heck I do. Very, very different. We're wildly different people. And we're never competitive in that nasty way a lot of brothers are. And actually, when I got better than him at tennis a few years ago and didn't even like beating him. But what I did resent was the favour of sort of my dad, where like my brother was older. So my dad was a big tennis fan, even though he's working class background. And he would play tennis with us, but he'd only hit with my brother, and he'd make me hit with my mum on the other side. And I'd be like, why can I never hit with my dad? Because it would be a lot better for me. No offense to my mum, my dad was better. So, but he only wanted to hit with my brother, and I hated that. So it's similar to God here. It's kind of like the favor of God is what they're trying to get, and that's what causes him to resent his brother so much. Yeah, because he's fallen out of favor, and it's not Abel's fault because he's just being Abel, as you say. He's just there, sort of innocently giving this offering. There's no indication that he's doing anything wrong.
Well, he's doing everything right, isn't he? He's making the appropriate sacrifices to God, and presumably therefore in his life as well. So he's doing everything right. So he's showing Cain up, and that's why Cain hates him. So I guess that's why he kills him. I suppose that's the answer to my question, isn't it? He kills him because he's showing him up.
Yeah, and I think it's slightly different with my tennis analogy because my dad was doing the wrong thing, and my brother should let me sometimes hit with him. But
so can we just say, just before we move on, because this is something I don't know whether it fits in here or not, but I think we're going to lose the motif of sacrifice when we move on, which is fine because that's where it goes. But this thing that Peterson says about like this story is all about making the proper sacrifices so that things are more likely to go well with you. And it was interesting to me listening. I don't know whether it was that one you sent me or another one. I listened to quite a few, but it was interesting to me because sometimes when you're listening to those Peterson lectures, you're sort of thinking to yourself, well, what is Jordan Peterson actually, what is his attitude to the Bible? What does he actually believe about the Bible? Does he believe, I don't really think he believes the Bible is divinely inspired or anything like that, but he thinks that kind of geniuses wrote it. That's why these people weren't, I'm hesitant to do my impression of him because I know yours is so, legendarily brilliant. But these people weren't idiots; they were geniuses. And
geniuses.
They were,
yeah.
That kind of stuff. But and he never quite comes out with it explicitly. But it was interesting in that lecture. I did get a flavour for where he's coming from, when he's saying, people have noticed, he reads out a bit from, I think it was probably a draft version of 12 Rules for Life, but he's sort of saying, over the years, people have realized, first we learned to speak and use tools and stuff. And then we realized that, if we make the proper sacrifices, things would go well for us. And then, sacrifice became a motif and blah, blah, blah. And I think the point he was making is that like we as humanity in millennia past have understood the significance of the concept of sacrifice and then written it into our mythologies, of which the Bible is one. And this is why you get these kind of stories, and this is why sacrifice is such a major motif. And he doesn't, again, he never really finishes the thought through. He never really kind of goes through and says, and that's what the Bible is, and that's all it is. But it's very similar to, it reminded me of Martin Heidegger's ontotheological critique of religion, where he says, that what we and this is actually something that the German theologian Ludwig Feuerbach also said, who's basically an atheist, is what we do is we kind of take concepts or ideas that we observe in the world and we sort of project them upwards to the skies or to the heavens or whatever. So what it sounded to me like Peterson was saying is like we've discovered the significance of sacrifice, the concept of sacrifice, and how important that is in human life. And so we've kind of theologized it and turned it into a religious motif. And then we've actually, in Christianity, and this isn't what he says explicitly, but it's kind of the implication, in Christianity, what you actually then end up with is God himself becoming a sacrifice. So this kind of perfect, well, this sort of the highest concept in religion, becoming sacrifice, and then that being almost like literally applied to God, so that God himself becomes a sacrifice. And then you see that in other religions as well, you know, or maybe not other religions, but in like more Norse mythology, and you know, other kind of, you know, mythological stories and so on and so forth. So I was just wondering, I think Peterson's kind of caught on the cusp of that question of whether or not, you know, Scripture and, you know, the Judeo-Christian religions are, or you know, Judaism and Christianity are merely kind of, you know, a sort of theological representation of profound psychological truths that humanity has discovered, or whether they are actually the, you know, objectively real embodiments of those truths on a theological level. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's certainly, he's not a literalist in the way that Pawson is, and he's far more literal. Yeah, he certainly doesn't seem to see them as literal, and he sees them as much more, like you say, psychological truths, mythological, and
but there are points at which he seems open. Do you remember that? Did you hear that? That conversation he had with Jonathan Pajot, where he was just kind of crying. I mean, it was when he was unwell, and he was sort of crying, and he was sort of talking about the way,
to narrow it down.
he was talking about. I mean, it was quite well, you know, it was all over Twitter and stuff. But he was like basically saying about how Christ is. I mean, I think he was addressing this very issue, and I can't quite remember the exact phraseology he was using, but he was basically saying Christ is, you know, he is the kind of, you know, the highest embodiment of these religious ideas that, you know, humanity has developed, but he could also be the kind of objective embodiment of them as well, for the reason that he's actually, you know, it's actually true. You know, essentially, those weren't the words he was using, but that's essentially what he was saying. He was kind of like, the way I was thinking about it is he was kind of saying, well, this is how it is on the on the horizontal level, and I really understand that very well. That sort of horizontal level, that psychological, anthropological level. But then, is there a theological reality where there's a sort of intersection between the horizontal and the vertical, and these two things come together? And that's actually really interesting, because that's exactly, I think, what happened for C.S. Lewis, who was, you know, as I'm sure you know, who's a scholar of English literature. So he was aware of these things in a similar way, like all these Norse myths, and, you know, these are the things kind of animated his imagination as a child. But what he came to see, and this was partly through his relationship with Tolkien, who was a friend of his, what he came to see is that this wasn't just operating on that kind of horizontal level, but it was operating in that way because there was a sort of vertical truth as well, where these things come together. And these things are not just, you know, the reason you have like Norse gods dying and sacrificing themselves isn't because it's just some sort of psychological truth that humanity has discovered in this sort of Jungian archetypal sense. It's because there is an objective truth which somehow inhabits the hearts of human beings, which they sometimes give voice to in myth and literature and story and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, after one of our podcasts, and I can't remember which, we've done so many now, I suggested you watch the clip of Lewis and Tolkien from that movie about Tolkien's life.
Oh yeah, I didn't do that.
Okay, well, Tolkien says that to him. He says, "Don't you?" Lewis says to him, "Oh, I see. You've already accepted these other lies and myths because you've accepted the one big lie of Christ." And where Tolkien says, "What you don't understand is that this is the one true myth." And he says it has the something like the ring of primary creation. I can't remember the exact phrase. And he's saying that is the one true myth. So that's kind of what you're saying. Yeah, there's with the Peterson options you're giving is one, is that Jesus is kind of the ultimate realization. I'm tempted to say apotheosis, but that will confuse it. Is a kind of synthesis of all these ideas over time about sacrifice and martyrdom, and someone's realized it perfectly. And the other version, like you say, is that he actually was like that, and that's why it was so impressive. Yeah, which is coming at it from the other side, and that's
like
which
one, and which one, I mean,
both pretty significant. But
it's amazing. I think that's an amazing thought, if I'm honest with you. I mean, I just wish that Peterson would really. I mean, we've developed it together, but you know, I think like Peterson, you know, I mean, it's like he's got to take that step, hasn't he? He's got to take the step into the reality of this, because he recognizes the profundity of this. Like, and also the other thing I've been thinking as we've been reading these things and preparing them is like how this ties together like so amazingly, you know, like all of these motifs, like they tie together in Christ just incredibly well. And I don't, you know, if you were to look at them and actually confront them, you'd have to be you'd have to be so cynical to just dismiss that and to say, well, really this is just a coincidence, that from start to finish the Old Testament seems to have all these sacrificial motifs which just find their expression in Christ in this unbelievably elegant way. I mean, something that I don't think we actually talked about on the last, I'm not sure if we talked about on the last podcast, but in the fall, in the narrative of the fall, just to go back a bit, when you have Genesis 3:15, this is often talked about as the first gospel, right? So I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise your heel. Sorry, you shall bruise his heel, right? So that's the serpent he's speaking to. So her offspring, meaning Christ, so he, that's Eve's offspring, meaning Christ, he shall bruise your head, so destroy you, he's going to break your head. And you, the serpent, shall bruise his heel. So, that means that Eve's offspring will be in some way damaged by Satan, which people have taken to mean the crucifixion. So even in chapter 3, if you're open to it, there's this kind of Christological resonance immediately, right there, and then it just continues, all the way through, in this unbelievable way.
There's another very controversial take on that, isn't there? Which is the doctrine of the serpent seed. Do you know about that one?
No, tell me that.
It's also known as a dual seed or two seed line doctrine, which is a controversial and fringe Christian religious belief which explains the biblical account of the fall of man by stating that the serpent mated with Eve in the Garden of Eden and that the offspring of their union was Cain. The event resulted in the creation of two races of people, the wicked descendants of the serpent, who are destined for damnation, and the righteous descendants of Adam, who are destined to have eternal life.
Yeah,
the doctrine frames human history as a conflict between these two races, in which the descendants of Adam will eventually triumph over the descendants of serpent. It's kind of, you can see, that's a horrific image, by the way, with the serpent. It's kind of like finding out your girlfriend slept with Russell Brand, but also, if I may, you can see how the problem with that is it's been taken into some fairly dodgy racial areas, that doctrine. So
yeah,
I hadn't heard of it.
Like all Christian heresies, it twists something which is true, which is this thing about they got the line of Abel, later Seth, and the line of Cain. But again, I mean, it must be stated that this is not primarily a racial line. I mean, it has expressions through the nation of Israel, but it's not primarily a racial line. It's about our attitude towards God. It's about whether or not we will worship the one true God, or whether we will worship essentially ourselves and a pantheon of false gods. And I mean, not to be too boring, but that is, if you take the Bible seriously, it quite clearly says in chapter 4 that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. So it doesn't say Eve knew the serpent and Adam, and it was ambiguous. So I think we can put pay to that quite quickly.
Yeah, and the stuff about the line, I don't know whether to get into stuff about the lines or do the nod bit next, because we've talked about lines, but which one do you want to do first? Because I've got to talk about the land of Nod, and then I've got to talk about the different lines of Cain and Abel.
Well, I don't mind either.
Let's
talk about. Go on. Well, let's talk about the lines, seeing as we're already talking about it.
Yeah, well, the lines, the only thing about that I'm very puzzled by some of this. I mean, because the line from Cain, you get music, which is Jubal, he was the father of those who play the lyre and pipe. And then you get Zillah also aboard Tubal Cain, he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, which is like metallurgy, presumably, and other things like that. And you also get farming. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of... Oh, no, hang on, that's the same one. Oh, yeah. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. That's Jabal. So isn't that just farming, or is that nomadic farming, or what? I mean, they're in tents, I suppose. So I don't really understand the lines, like why some of these weird things... What's so bad about, metallurgy or music? But some people have said it's to do with urbanization, and that, well, when he goes to Nod, maybe I'll bring them together, because after the line... And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And of course, we have the Steinbeck novel, East of Eden, and all these other things. And we still have nodding off and a pun on land of Nod and all this kind of thing. We use these puns for sleep and so on. But the land of Nod, people have all kinds of different views on what it was, whether he was just away from... It was an ungodly place, or it was a more urban place, and Cain went there and developed cities. Pawson points out that... cities mean a concentration of sin, and so all human progress was tainted by Cain So you get these cities, and it's sort of impressive in one way, but it's actually tainted by Cain's sin, and he's over in Nod doing bad stuff. So it depends what you think Nod is and what you think it signifies, and then what these lines signify.
Yeah. So, I mean, just take the first part first. I mean, I think that Pawson is sort of partly right, but as is often the case, he sort of overstates it slightly. So, I mean, the way that I would see this is that this isn't really about urbanization. This is about being human and God's common grace, right? So I don't think that it's the right way to look at this and say, well, these things are bad because they were founded by Cain. Cain is a founder of a civilization, right? So and civilization is marked by culture, so like architecture and music and farming or whatever it might be, but it's also marked by sin, which is rebellion against God. But the amazing thing about it, and again it's just obviously true, is that human beings, even when they rebel against God, still are enabled by God's common grace to have culture, to have families, and to build a world that works, and to actually build a world that works really well, and to produce amazing things. So that would be, just to repeat that phrase, that would be a sort of extrapolation of the concept of God's common grace. So God's special or saving grace would be like when God reveals himself in Christ and saves people from eternal damnation through Christ. But God's common grace is just his common goodness to humanity. And if you think about the humanities as a kind of subject area, it's kind of a good way of thinking about that, because the humanities are just an expression of what human beings are. So they're capable of creating art and literature or whatever it might be, painting, buildings, and so on. But we're also capable of great sin and evil as well. But even where there is so this is where I think Paulson's a bit too negative. Even where there's a massive concentration of sin, like in a very, very sinful place, you can still have a functioning city and culture and people having families and there being law and order and all of these kind of things. So I would see that this is a kind of expression of God's common grace to humanity. That's the way I would see this.
Okay, interesting. It's a lot more generous than old Pawson there. And
in fact, I would say almost the opposite to Pawson. Like, you could argue that God wants concentrations of people because of the mandate, right, to fill the earth, to multiply and fill the earth. So God is in favor of concentrations of people. Whereas the implication of what Pawson's saying is like, the countryside is a more godly place because there are fewer people there. But I would argue against that. I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. Ultimately, we're not as Christians, we're not people who think that humanity is a cancer upon the earth. We think people are fundamentally good. So, yeah, you might get a greater concentration of sin in a city, but you also get a greater concentration of culture and a greater possibility for righteousness and people worshipping God together. So,
Yeah, I do sometimes get the impression Pawson has a more negative view of humanity. When we get on to Noah, maybe next time, it's sort of, he talks about, obviously God deciding to get rid of all humans, and he does talk about, the world being a bad place and people being bad quite a lot. I have noticed that it's certainly one fairly strict view. But yeah, it says, Cain knew it. So moving on from the East of Eden, it says, Cain knew his wife and she conceived and bore Enoch. So we know some famous Enochs. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad. It goes into the whole line. But that's the city part, that he built a city. Yeah. And some people have even said, so Cain and Abel, people have pointed out, appear in other texts apart from Genesis. So some people see it as a sort of archetypal story, and Abel as the first murder victim and the first martyr, Cain the first murderer. And there's an interesting one where modern scholars typically view the stories of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel to be about the development of civilization during the age of agriculture, not the beginnings of man. So that's another reading, obviously not really a Christian reading, more sort of objectively scholarly reading or something. So that is going on there. Yeah. And it goes into all the lines, which I don't think we have to go into, which we've talked about anyway, the line of music and metallurgy. Yeah. And then it gets down to...
Lamech is important, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was about to get into. It gets onto Lamech.
Yeah.
Don't worry, James, I've got it so covered.
You got it.
So I'm a professional, as Andrew Tate says. Lamech said... the strange bit of Lamech is that it's going through all the lines, and it goes, the sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah, full stop. Then it just goes, Lamech said to his wives, which is an extraordinary literary device. I mean, talk about like postmodern literature. you've just skipped, because I've read all these sort of weird postmodern literature books that kind of change the form of writing. But that's a hell of a jump in maybe I shouldn't say hell, it's a heck of a jump in writing just to go, Lamech said to his wives, because you've been doing this line going through presumably hundreds of years. Then what you're doing is leaping to a specific scene with Lamech, which is an extraordinary thing to do, because you've got a very narrow. There is a literally the device thing called récit and histoire, which is about the content versus the way you tell the story. You take a great writer like Thomas Bernhard in a book called The Loser, one of the great novels. He spends the whole time saying, "I thought as I entered the inn." So the forward motion in the story is a man just entering an inn, and then a few other things happen at the end. But for the vast majority of the book, he's remembering stuff as he enters the inn. So this is a literary device. It's a great book. I'm aware this podcast gets a bit heavy, by the way. When you said before, reminds me of Heidegger's onto-theological subject. I was thinking, the few people that have said, like this podcast, gets quite heavy at times. I was thinking, that's one of those times. Anyway.
Man, the onto-theological critique is one of the most important sort of intellectual critiques of religion there is. So.
But you admit it's not a typical thing on every podcast.
Yeah, I suppose so.
It's not on it's not on Alistair Campbell's podcast, that. But anyway, my point is, you've started with quite a sort of narrow story of, Cain and Abel, this happened, then he killed his brother, and that's sort of quite, the action's happening in a fairly literal way in real time. That could happen pretty quickly. But then you suddenly go through generations and generations. Then you suddenly skip to Lamech said to his wives, which I find crazy, unless someone can tell me I'm interpreting this wrong. Anyway, Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So he announces he's suddenly killed someone just like Cain. But why would? And how can he announce it himself? Unlike, whereas it was God that gave the curse on Cain, or gave the sort of protection of Cain. Yeah. And why is it 77-fold? Why is it so much more?
Yeah, great question. So I think lots of stuff about Lamech. So verse 19, Lamech took 2 wives. So this is the beginning of a kind of polygamous culture, which is a departure from what God intends to be, in the beginning with Adam and Eve. There's,
right, another thing about the line of Cain is polygamy. It comes from it as well as music and all these other terrible things.
Yeah. And you could also see that as... when it says about your husband ruling over you, it's sort of it's an outworking of a husband ruling over you, I think. So I mean, I've seen before people saying, the Bible's got all sorts of different things about marriage in it. It has polygamous and monogamous and blah blah blah, but it doesn't really. If you read it in context,
they're not advocated.
No, polygamy. Yeah, you might describe somebody being polygamous, but it doesn't mean that that's what's being put forward or advocated, as you say. It's clear that Adam and Eve is God's template, and this is a departure from that template as humanity degrades and descends into sin. And that's the point about Lamech, is he's a continuation. He's a sort of furthering of the sin of Cain. This is what happens as people continue to distance themselves from God and his ways. They get gradually worse and worse, and that's the whole point, is that he's worse than Cain. So not only is he a polygamist, and he's speaking to these women in a quite a I don't know, like quite a like a rapper almost, like a sort of what would you call it, like a kind of patriarchal,
authoritarian
yeah, exactly. And that's it's not good. I mean, we make jokes about this kind of thing, but it's not good to treat your wife or to treat your women or in a way which is degrading. And then of course he's killing people and so on. And then so this here is this is one of the things important to know about Scripture, is that it uses numbers, and numbers have symbolic significance. So if Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So 7 is a kind of perfect number, so it means like complete. So if you have like something being 7, 7-fold, that means it's Cain's revenge was 7-fold, so it was complete. But my revenge is 77-fold, which is like it's like complete times complete, if you see what I mean. And then just one more thing on that, which I think is quite interesting, is so just round that out. So it's way worse. That's the point. It's way worse than Cain's revenge. I'm so much more hardcore than him, that kind of thing. Like, he's boasting. But the interesting thing, just to bring it to somewhere else, is like I did a sermon on this recently, which is why I was thinking about it. In Matthew chapter 18, I think it's that, Peter asks Christ, how many times should we forgive? As many as 7 times. And Christ says, I don't tell you 7 times, I tell you 70 times. And in some translations, they translate that as 70 times 7. So there's actually that's definitely a reference to Lamech and this thing here, because you've got 7 and then 7, and then you've got 77-fold. So so Christ is clearly referencing Genesis 4 verse 24. So it's getting mixed up with the numbers there. So anyway, the point being that he's like reversing this web of vengeance and violence and things like that through the generous practice of grace and forgiveness. So there's that as well. I think it's Matthew chapter 18 as well. So there's that there. So yeah, so that's some thoughts on that.
All right, very interesting. That explains the 77-fold to some degree. And here we carry on. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enoch. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord, which is pretty much where Cain and Abel ends. And that line, Jamie, since last time I have an email on, actually. So this is an evolving series. So I asked what that meant last time, and we weren't sure. And I have two completely opposite interpretations. So the line, at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord, and Lord in capitals, meaning Yahweh, therefore, because that's what it means every time it says Lord in this version in capitals. So Kevin writes, Dear Nick, the fact that people began to call on the name of the Lord during the days of Enoch was a sign of the separation that had grown between humankind and the Creator. Until then, people had called him Father, as Jesus says we should, Luke 11:2. Now they had to address him formally as strangers. Very, very interesting. And then he goes on to praise you and what we're doing with this podcast. Not praise it in a like we're God, of course, but you know what I mean. And he says he's gone back to church, so that's brilliant.
Great.
So thanks for that,
good.
Kevin.
Yeah.
But I have to contrast that with Pawson, right? Who says the exact opposite. So he said, because of Seth's line, man began to call on the name of Yahweh, and he's saying this is a good thing. Pawson, the fact that they start to think of God in that way, in the Yahweh way, which he uses the word always. Someone else has sent me a really good version of Yahweh, if I can find it, which I might, because I was going to read this out at the end, but they have another good translation. Oh well, I can't find it, but I think it's here. Yeah, there was a literal translation that Robbo offered on Twitter or X, which is he will be, is, and always was. That was his version of Yahweh, and Pawson's is just the word always. So Pawson seems to be saying they sort of had this great understanding of the Lord now from Seth, whereas Kevin is writing to us there saying no, it's actually that they became separated and it became more formal. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Kevin, and that's great. Really pleased you're going back to church. But sadly, I definitely go with Pawson here. It seems to be the case that, I mean, if you read this chapter, the whole way through, you've got the godly Abel disappearing when he's killed by Cain, and then the whole of this civilization kind of developing, and then within the midst of this civilization, you then have Seth being born, and it's kind of like a holy seed being planted in the midst of a corrupt civilization. And again, Seth is, in this story, Seth is an image of Christ. I mean, Christ ultimately comes from the line of Seth. If you look at the genealogy in the book of Adam, the book of Luke, Christ is traced back to Seth and beyond to Adam. So the point being that this is a kind of picture. You can almost see it. It's like Christ being born in Bethlehem in the midst of a world which is not interested in God and his ways. It's a similar thing here. So Seth is being born in the midst of this civilization which is degrading and falling apart because it's distancing itself from God. And I see that as all one kind of thing. So you have Eve bearing Seth bearing Enoch, and then the godly line being established. And it's at that time, so when those people were born, so through them, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And that's the way that I see it. It's the people are, the worship of the true proper worship of God is being established. I mean, the question of why it's the Lord, why it's that word Yahweh or Jehovah, as David Pawson says, it's definitely not. is another question. But I think it's not because people are getting it wrong. It's because they're getting it right, in my opinion. Mm. And I don't like Pawson calling it always. I just don't think that's right. It's to do with existence. The word Yahweh. It's Thomas Aquinas understood. He understood that very clearly, and he called God He who is. He I mean, roughly speaking, that's the way he translated that word, he who is, like he who has existence within himself. Always, I just think it just has a slightly different connotation, slightly sort of blander connotation, and I don't think it works in a literary sense either. So,
okay, well, maybe we should look to Robbo on this, who tweeted about it, saying, "Well done on the Genesis podcast. I really enjoyed it." And he says, and he's coming from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, and he just wants to clarify a few things. He said it's great that you're learning Hebrew, and he talks about Hebrew for a bit.
It's not going quickly, by the way. Just to say. I'm still working on the alphabet. It's pretty hard. Right.
It's too long. Yeah, he does say it's a strange language. It's too long to read it all, but yeah, he translates it as a Yahweh. He doesn't use Yahweh because the Orthodox Jews never say it by name, but he said can be best translated as a compound word that combines future, present, and past forms of the verb to be. I translate it literally as he will be, is, and always was. This sense of the Almighty being across time and space is extremely prevalent in the grammar used in the Hebrew text. Then he goes on and says, an appreciation of the two main names, the one referred to above, and Elohim. So Orthodox Jewish people don't say Elohim because they don't even want to say the H bit, so they say a K, just so that's why that's there. That's my other reading on that, is also vital in understanding what is being said. The four-letter name is a reflection of his infinite symmetry, the aspect which resides outside and encircles the physical universe. Elohim, which is not a plural sense of gods as is often misinterpreted, it means literally God of all powers, is a reflection of his finite symmetry, which resides in all things in the universe, in every atom, the very way that atoms work. It's unsurprising to me that the most common age of protagonist's death in the Torah is 137. It's also Abraham's age at the binding of Isaac, without doubt the most important passage in the entire book, one which we read every single day. Because we talked about numbers a little bit before. He's talking about the significance of this 137, and this is just answering a question we raised last time, and it's a bit dense, is that he thinks there are hidden meanings behind these numbers. He says that the age 930 links Adam to King David, for example. So there's these ages that people live to, like Adam and Noah, and there's reasons for them that they're very complicated anyway, that I don't really know about. But that was just a little update from last time. So I think we've pretty much come to the end of Cain and Abel. There's and it has filled the time, so that's good. We only need to. That means we can do Noah next time. But maybe a few things we might have missed is just, well, I think I've talked about that actually, the different interpretation of it, how it occurs in other places other than just Genesis. I mean, what do you make of that, this idea that versions of this appear in all kinds of places, and that, an academic theologian here, Joseph Blenkinsop, holds that Cain and Abel are symbolic rather than real, like almost all of the persons, places, and stories in primeval history. The first 11 chapters of Genesis, they are mentioned nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, a fact that suggests the history is a late composition added to Genesis to serve as an introduction. Just how late is a matter for dispute. The history may be as late as the Hellenistic period. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I don't really want to wade into the academic debate because I just don't know very much about it. I don't see that they need to be mentioned, over and over again in the scripture in order to be taken seriously. I mean, they're certainly mentioned in the New Testament, so that's kind of good enough for me. Look, Nick. I think
Jesus says the blood of the righteous has been spilled from Abel to Zechariah or something along those lines.
Yeah, he does, and it's also in the book of Hebrews as well, and in the book of James. But this whole thing about like the academic way of approaching things, and I'm not against academia. I've got a PhD. I've spent a lot of time in that world. Not in the area of biblical studies, in the area of theology, which is different. They're related.
It was on Metallica, wasn't it, in your PhD? Enter Sandman. Just kidding. A little bit of lightness
just to be clear, no, it was not. It was definitely not. It's just that's a side interest. Anyway, the point is like so one thing that scholars posit about the early books of the Bible is that they were all written by different people, right? So there's like 4 sources, like JEDP, different authors, and they were kind of stitched together. And you have Peterson says things like this as well. I mean, he never sort of comes out and says it, but he says, these are fragments, and we don't know the full story and all this kind of stuff, So he's kind of he's alluding to those theories, but on the other hand, these are theories which I've done biblical studies. I've got an MA in biblical studies, and so it's not like I don't know anything about this. But it's like it's all speculative. It's just people speculating about what things might be because of the kind of vocabulary is used and the sort of different theological emphasis that are in place and so on. But if you see a single divine hand behind it all, there's a sort of, as I was saying earlier, sort of astonishing coherence to the whole thing, which makes perfect sense. So a lot of it depends on what your starting point is. What's your presupposition? Is your presupposition that this is simply a human book which is somehow reflective of these sort of archetypes which human beings have developed, which in itself would be a pretty astonishing thing. I mean, it's hardly it's almost supernatural in itself to say that humanity is sort of got this kind of archetypal unconscious, which all of us human beings, we all have access to this thing, and it's kind of taken shape in these myths just almost coincidentally, which would be amazing in itself, so you sort of start from that viewpoint, or, I'm not saying these are the only options, or you say, well, maybe that archetypal unconscious, maybe that is real, but it's actually real because there's some kind of theological or ultimate reality behind it, and the Bible is actually reflective of that. That these other texts, when you look at them, they may bear some resemblance, but they don't have the same kind of coherence and power and enduring power as the Scripture. And that would be my position. I don't want to preempt the conversation on the flood, but the flood would be another example of that, where you have all these other myths about a global flood. Now, that might be because a global flood really happened, or it might be because there's some kind of archetypal unconscious reality that human beings are tapping into. But I think when you look at Scripture, when you look at the description of the flood, it's far more sort of plausible and resonant and deep in the Bible than it is in, like the Enuma Elish or wherever, where they just, the accounts seem like far more sort of mythological and silly, because the gods are like, they can't sleep, so they deluge the world to kill all the humans because the humans are making too much noise. The Bible's not like that. It's far, far more serious.
I think that's some brilliant points there, and I like that you've done a teaser for our next episode.
Yeah.
Next week on Genesis Explored, the flood. Nick rifles through his notes and tries to operate the software. The recording goes wrong again, and Rev Jamie Franklin comes in with the knowledge. So next time we'll do Noah and the flood, but and the prelude to the flood. But you're very right. I just felt I had to put that in because, I didn't want anyone at home saying, well, it could just be this academic reading, or this, Cain and Abel appears in other places. And I just saw it today and I thought, I'll add that in. But you're right, it is infinitely banal compared to the other version to think that, for example, here's a line from Wikipedia. It has been seen as a depiction of nomadic conflict, the struggle for land and resources and divine favor between nomadic herders and sedentary farmers. I mean, if Cain and Abel is just about the nomadic herders versus the sedentary farmers, that is fairly banal, isn't it? And I don't see it like that. Yeah,
it's just boring, isn't it? It's a boring way of reading the text, and I'm not, and it's fine. Look, people, I don't want to insult people in biblical studies because, I know I've got a lot of friends who are in biblical studies, Nick.
Some of my best friends.
Some of my best friends are really into biblical studies, but, it's, to me, to me, there's a danger with biblical studies, which is that it kills the text. It's like doing, the Roman Catholic great theologian Hans van Balthasar said that you can only do an autopsy on a dead body, referring to Scripture. Like, Scripture is a living thing, and if you dichotomize it too much, and if you chop it up and look at the individual bits and you become obsessed with them, then you lose like the living spirit of the thing. You can't take it as the whole piece that it is, and it becomes this very sort of pedantic, Exodus 5:27b, what original Hebrew word was in the text, and how does that affect our understanding of, ancient Near Eastern cultures in 656 BC or whatever. It's like you're losing the point if you do it like that.
Yeah,
see what I mean?
Absolutely. Cain killed Abel, and some of these biblical studies people are in danger of killing the magic of the Bible. Jamie, that's all I've got to say.
That's right. I mean, I hasten to add that systematic theology can obviously be abused massively, and it is, Nick, most of the time
I second
nowadays.
That without knowing what you mean.
It's absolutely true.
Awesome.
Just listen to this podcast. Like, if anyone's interested in biblical studies and systematic theology, they should just listen to us, Nick. That's the answer.
And you have me as the everyman layman just wading through it, trying to understand. And we have the expert. It's a great format. People are already loving it.
We've got a monopoly on this, Nick.
Absolutely. Someone called it genuinely enlightening, the last one, Jamie, and that's good. Largely due to you. I'm going to say largely, maybe even solely, but it's certainly, when I set the thing up, so I'm going to say largely due to you. But hopefully you'll come back and do the Noah one.
For sure, yeah.
And Where can people find you once again? Obviously, you do the Irreverent podcast, which I should have said at the start again, but I didn't.
It's okay. It's all right. Yeah, so Irreverent podcast, Irreverent Faith and Current Affairs. What is it called? Yeah, it is called that. Irreverent Faith and Current Affairs. Yeah, it's just everything's on our website, irreverentpod.com. Irreverent with a D, not with a T. It's a pun on the word irreverent, or the words irreverent and reverend. So
it's such a good pun. It actually messes up the word irreverent for you because your brain suddenly goes, is it irreverent for a second? Once you're a hardcore irreverent listener, it actually ruins language for you. That's how good it is.
Yeah, that's how good it is. I hasten to add that my co-host Tom thought of it, not me, which is a shame. And other people have subsequently said that they've thought of it and wanted to use it as a podcast. But that's a really interesting example of the archetypal unconscious functioning there, because like we've created this word and then other people have independently thought of it and thought we'll start a podcast, and then Googled it and realised, sorry, there's already a podcast called Irreverent, so you can't do that. So irreverentpod.com. So that's, and I'm on Twitter. And by the way, since we last spoke, I think it was, because you criticised me for having this obscure Twitter handle, which had nothing to do with my name.
Criticised is strong.
Well, that's okay. I don't mind a criticism. I've changed it. So now I'm Jamie Franklin on Twitter, and I'm just at Jamie Franklin 40. The reason I chose 40, Nick, is because it's one of those other symbolic numbers which speaks of completeness. So I thought, 40 is available, so I'll do that. So at Jamie Franklin 40, and that's about it really in terms of you just that's where you can find me.
Because you're not even 40, are you? So it's not your age. It's not a midlife crisis.
I'm less than 40. I'm less than 40, and that would age. If you do your age on Twitter, you're a fool, aren't you? Because
that'd be terrible. Yeah,
you can't change it famously. Change it every year. Yeah, famously.
Famously, time advances. At Jamie Franklin 40 on X, as it's now called, of course. We've even advanced beyond even called Twitter. So that's on X, an Irreverent podcast, and look out for our next one, where we tackle Noah and the flood. All being well, God willing, we'll be back and doing that.
Yeah. This is great, isn't it? I mean, honestly, Nick, I think I'm learning loads doing this, and I hope, from you and also from the other things I'm reading. But it just shows me. I'm so encouraged by it because it just shows me like how deep these things actually are, and even just going back to the Peterson lectures and listening to those and sort of thinking through his engagement with it. It's an incredible thing, and I hope people are paying attention to this and engaging with the same resources, because I think you'll see like how profound these texts really are, and I would also encourage people listening to this to just literally go back to the stories themselves and just literally read them through, especially in the light of these conversations, and just think about them, because they're incredible stories.
Absolutely, and people really are doing that. And just quickly, I want to thank people for their reviews as well on the Apple app. Someone says, world class, this podcast is epic enough to prompt my first ever review. Thank you, Nick, and please run a series with Rev Jamie Franklin on each book of the Bible. I started reading it when you embarked, having recently refound my faith. Keep it up and stay based. What an amazing review from Monrod SJ. I don't know how you say that, but it's a brilliant review. Thank you very much.
Great.
Genuinely enlightening, cab passenger. The episode looking at Genesis with Rev Franklin was an absolute masterpiece. Nick is doing God's work here, spreading the word to a wide audience in an entertaining and accessible way. Please keep going. Rev JF, this is from Fat, Drunk and Stupid, says, more Rev J Franklin, that was excellent. And Jenny G, well, I hate to read out praise for myself, as you know, but it says, Nick is very charming, funny, and down to earth. Interesting guest. I really enjoyed the latest podcast discussion on Genesis. Great podcast. So many people have praised, I won't read the ones praising me solely, but so many people have praised the Genesis ones with you, Jamie, so people are really liking it. Great. And I just want to say, with that in mind, if you want to support the podcast, sorry to do the old plug here, but please go to buymeacoffee.com/Nick Dixon, because, we employ someone on the podcast. It's quite hard to afford all this, and we're doing it very DIY for now. So buymeacoffee.com/Nick Dixon to support the current thing, so to speak. And we'll be back with Jamie soon, and we'll be back with another episode next week. But thank you very much once again, Jamie.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.